Good morning, everyone, and it's a pleasure to be here once again. I think it's just marvelous, the caliber of speakers that we've had at this year's conference. And this morning, I guess I get to start off this panel discussion. I was going to just talk about a few of the things that that I've listened to and heard this weekend. And I'm going to start off by this this one comment about we have heard and are all under the belief that planning is a relatively new undertaking. It's fairly new, this whole idea of planning in these, we've seen these urban growth plans and Niagara escarpment plans and a number of different things. But it's not quite true. Planning has been with us forever. Forever. The only difference, of course, is who's doing the planning. That's what has changed. And government planning, of course, is relatively new. And I just wanted to maybe share a thought or two about where I live, which is just about 100 kilometers west of Ottawa. Live on a few acres of land. Used to be was severed off from an original farm. Just to give you a bit of an idea about planning. If you come to my place, you'll travel up a gravel road, a little more than about a half kilometer in length to get to my place. And you might say, why would anybody build a laneway half a kilometer in? That's poor planning, isn't it? Certainly wouldn't be allowed these days, I'm sure. But half a kilometer in, you'll find that that's the highest point of land on my property. So it's not subject to dampness and flooding or wet basements. It's actually a pretty nice spot. And now that home is it's an old stone home built in the 1850s. I don't think they had any architectural plans when they built it. Sure, somebody had some plans. Sure, they weren't reviewed or approved by many people. But it's also interesting on that, right beside that, the main house, the old stone farmhouse, is the original homestead, dating back to about 1816 or so, an old log building, which of course you're not allowed to have two homes on your property either. That's another planning violation in Ontario, but it was obviously allowed back then. That old log home has since, over the century, became a chicken coops and outbuildings and storage facilities. What happened there, obviously, was some planning. The buildings are set in a position against the prevailing winds. They're set on the high ground. They're set on areas where it's easy to get to the good fields and good pasture for the livestock that were once there. I don't keep any livestock or anything at all. However, the planning was done, but it was done by the individual who lived there, the person who owned the property. And I think they did a pretty good job. They did a good enough job 150 years ago that I really liked the place when I drove up that laneway when it was for sale and decided to buy it. And I think that's one of the things that I've seen happen over the course of my time is, and what has actually been the motivator, one of the great motivations in government planning, is just this lack of confidence that we are experiencing in society today. Lack of confidence of people in other people. Our lack of faith and confidence that other people can do things and do them well. That, and I'll share you this I think there's a good reason why we are losing confidence in our friends and our neighbors and ourselves. Actually, everybody thinks they can plan for themselves. It's just that nobody else can plan for themselves. And I'll give you this one little story. Everybody's heard that common sense is not very common anymore. I'm sure there's nobody here that hasn't heard that phrase. And indeed, if common sense wasn't very common, then it would be a misnomer, and we'd have to call it something else if common sense was not common. But there's a reason that came to my light, came to my understanding of this. Years ago, when I was in the Landowners Association, I was having a large meeting in Ontario about property rights. And there was 500 or 600 people at this meeting getting ready to demonstrate in Queen's Park and have tractor parades and closing up some government buildings at the time. And it was a wonderful evening. Hundreds of people were there asking thoughtful, good questions. They're motivated and inspiring. And there was, after that meeting, I was driving back to Lanark County with a few friends, and it was about a 3-hour drive or so. And we started talking about and reflecting on that meeting. And it soon came that the only discussion was about this one person who was at the meeting that night. Excuse me, I'm going to get some water. There was one person at the meeting that night who was very critical. He was asked some very stupid questions, I guess is what I'm saying. And anyway, for 3 hours driving home, that's all we talked about was this one fool. Right? This one fool. We had an audience of 500 or 600 people, but all we spoke about was this one person who was clearly from a different world than the rest of us. And it dawned on me at that time that that's the way our society works these days. We speak about the one fool and not the 499 good people. And it was really that it came so abundantly clear to me shortly after that. I used to, Global TV used to have this OPP sergeant on every weekend. Sergeant Cam Woolley. Anybody? I see Glenn and a few other people. Anyway, Cam Woolley would come on the Global News every weekend and give the most outrageous examples of highway traffic violations that weekend. Right? And you know, he'd give us the story that the OPP caught somebody driving down the highway at 150 kilometers an hour with his baby in his arm and a bottle of whiskey in the other hand, you know, whatever, and a trailer loaded with his hillbilly belongings, whatever. And, you know, every weekend we would see that and we would hear it. And it became obvious to me that Cam Woolley was doing the same thing that myself and my friends were doing coming back from that landowner meeting. We were only talking about the one idiot. He didn't talk about the hundreds of thousands of other people, the millions of people who were driving safely on our roads, who were not getting into accidents, who weren't drinking a bottle of scotch while they were driving down the road. He was talking about the one, the two, the very few. And I think this has built up with our media, with our politicians for sure, that we see this very few examples of inappropriate or wrong or foolish behavior, and then come to the belief that none of us have common sense, that we're all like that driver going down the highway reading the newspaper with his child in his arm and his hillbilly belongings in the trailer. It's not true. And I would say that's one of the things that I've has become a purpose of mine, is to speak about the good people in this province, the good people in this country. There's far more of them. There's many of them. Seldom that I don't meet people that aren't sensible, reasonable, and have common sense. And our laws should be there to protect them. So I'll just finish off with this one thing on planning and development. As we see you can see the motivation increasing, that we continue need to take away the choices of individuals to plan for themselves and deposit that jurisdiction with other government authorities and bodies. But there is a huge cost to it, huge cost to government planning. And I see it every day in my work, hearing from constituents. And I'll give you one example. There was a doctor recently wanted to build a one-bedroom addition on his property on the Rideau Lakes. Right? His property is about 200 feet above the lake. It's not in any floodplain. Well, if we get maybe some rains of biblical proportions, maybe he'll be in the floodplain. But otherwise, he spent 2 years trying to get approval to build a one-bedroom addition onto his year-round home. Going through the conservation authorities, Parks Canada, the local municipality, the county, and a number of the conditions that they wanted him to comply with was a covenant, a protective covenant on that land forever, that for him to get approval to build one-bedroom addition, he would have to remove his boat launch from his property. He would have to remove his boat dock from the property. He would have to plant native vegetation between the waterfront and his house 200 feet above. I don't know what sort of vegetation. You're not going to get much vegetation on that steep slope as it was, but anyway. And these were all things that were to be forever covenants on his property. We did have to use some strong advocacy to keep the boat launch and to keep the boat dock and to reduce the native vegetation that they wanted. And we finally did get that one-bedroom addition built. But 2 years of approval process, I can't believe how much additional cost went into it for that process. But that's what we've got with planning is happening now throughout, whether it's a home on the Rideau Lake, or whether it's a subdivision, whether it's a commercial building, whatever it is, we are subjecting people to an endless bureaucracy and time and cost, which only adds cost to everybody in society and adds no benefit whatsoever. Thank you very much. I'll turn it over to
No, I really appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a wonderful conference, and I am frankly amazed that you're all here. I've been told that all Canadians were in church this time of the day. So in any event, let me first of all compliment MPP Hilliard for his presentation before, putting the one-bedroom, 2-year approval process into the context, let us say, of developing a 100 or a 200 house subdivision. If the developer manages to sit it out, it's going to cost an awful lot more because of the interest charges, and there's a pretty good chance that the housing will never be built. So these are real important issues that regrettably the public bureaucracy tends not to understand. But it was a real pleasure for me to hear Stockwell Day yesterday talk about prosperity and property rights and so on, and in fact it helped me cut my over long remarks yesterday in our session quite a bit. The point is, there is a purpose for property rights. Now, I realize I don't have to try to convince any of you in this room about how important property rights are. But I hope you all know that this message does not sell with everyone. The reason, for example, that I am in favor of property rights is because without property rights and rule of law, you cannot have prosperity, which of course was Stockwell Day's point yesterday, very well made. And the big problem, of course, that I see at this point in Canada and quite frankly across the Western democracies, but I think the problem is particularly concerning in Canada right now because of the spread, is the problem of urban containment policy. The idea that we've got to draw lines around our communities, we can't develop on the outside, we've got to try to force people into transit services and out of their cars, something that hasn't happened anywhere in the world. And the basic problem with all of that is that just as any time you ration anything, we get into a situation where prices are driven up. And anybody that tells you otherwise, I don't care whether it's whether it's Metro Vancouver or University of Calgary, anybody that believes anything other than that, all things being equal, is advocating sunrises in the West economics. It's just not right. Now, and so the basic problem is, what we've got is a situation in Canada, a situation in Australia, New Zealand, the United Kingdom, and good parts of the United States, and again, it's only in part of Canada at this point, like in the United States, is that housing is 2 to 3 times as expensive as it should be. That means all of that money is not available for the creation of jobs, which this society could use. It's not available for the increase of incomes of people in poverty. And based upon these outcomes, you would have to assume that these policies must certainly come from uncaring right-wing administrations. Yet what we find around the world is they are routinely the product of left-wing governments, unfortunately too often with right-wing compliance. So the point is, we've got to be thinking about the future, because the future is going to be much more challenging for the Western democracies than has been the past. Now, you think about what the situation is at this point in Canada. Vancouver, we have a situation where the median house price is about 9.5 times the median household income. Now, we do an annual affordability survey covering 350 markets in 6 countries plus Hong Kong. Only Hong Kong is worse than Vancouver. And it isn't even close anymore. Even Sydney has begun to come down just a little bit. And the point is, I find it amazing that you talk to people in Vancouver and they all agree that housing is too expensive, but yet no one is willing to admit what the problem is. That is, nobody in a policy-making position. There is the tendency to say, oh, well, there's no consensus, you know, that urban containment drives up land prices. Well, that's like saying there's no consensus on what happens when OPEC decides to cut off oil to the West. And I realize most of you probably aren't old enough to remember that, but the fact is there's plenty of consensus, and the people that tell you there is no consensus are frankly ignoring the great mass of the economic evidence. It is, in fact, unbelievable to me that any respectable social democrat in British Columbia can support the land use policies that are there in Vancouver. Sadly, these policies are spreading. Believe it or not, under the government of Mike Harris, you had the coming of the smart growth policies in Ontario, which were expanded upon and were approved and finalized by the McGuinty government. We have seen, as a result, in 8 years, the median multiple, the median house price compared to median household income of the Toronto area go from 3.9, which is close to where it should be, to 5.9, and I would suggest to you it's just beginning at this point. In Ottawa, we've seen much more modest house price increases, but I think there are 2 reasons that that's the case. One, that generally land use regulation is a little more liberal, believe it or not, on the Quebec side. Just like in Portland, the existence of somewhat more liberal land use regulation on the Washington state side tends to moderate the house price increases. And the other point is that, frankly, the city of Ottawa hasn't been as fast as the people in the GTA in terms of implementing the regulations. We have Calgary, where you have a planning director who tells us proudly that he doesn't do suburbs, And we are now looking at house price increases that are unbelievable there. And all of these markets, except Vancouver, if you go back to 2004 when we did our first report, all of these markets were actually not bad in 2004, and they've got much worse. It was surprising to me, for example, in 2004 to find out that Montreal had a median multiple of about 3. It's now 5.1. Because the government in Montreal, the government in Quebec, having the opportunity and the plan to take a look at the agricultural reserve, did not finish the review as it should have been finished, and as a result, Montreal is now looking at huge cost increases, and I think it will get worse. One of the big problems in all of this is raised by David Seymour yesterday in his presentation, that of interjurisdictional competition. What happens when you combine all of the governments in an area, such as has occurred here in Ottawa, into one? The planning department of the big city government takes over, and there's no hope for people in looking for affordable housing. And this is not just the big cities of Canada; it's some of the medium-sized cities as well. I mean, I can tell you, it hasn't had terrible results yet, but the results look bad. Take a look at what's happened since the consolidation of Dartmouth and the city of Halifax and other communities in that area. Certainly some wrong directions. So I think one of the things we also need to do, we really need to make people understand the importance of property rights to housing affordability, economic growth, affluence, and the eradication of poverty. I would certainly hope, I'm affiliated to for some purposes with the Heritage Foundation in Washington. I've done work also for the Fraser Institute, which I have the greatest respect for, in addition to the Frontier Center. But Fraser and Heritage both have have done some really great work in annual analyses of economic freedom. But in neither case have they looked at the economic freedom to develop and have control over your own land. And when I see Hong Kong at the top of the list, I say, do they have any idea? And I'm not being facetious, but the fact is, there isn't economic freedom in Hong Kong with respect to what you can do with your land any more than there is in Portland or Vancouver or increasingly places like Toronto. And I would hope that we would see those studies expand to include those things. But again, the basic bottom line is we want a prosperous nation in the long run. Canada has done very well, and as I said in our presentation yesterday, my sense is that Canada is the economic policy leader of the free world at this point, without question. At the same time, we really need to get land use policy under control, or the coming generations are not going to live as well as we have. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Wendell, and thank you, everybody. I just want to take 1 minute to do a shameless plug for something completely unrelated. How many people here have heard of C2C Journal, as in Charlie to Charlie? Oh, that's great, and there's actually a few people here, Professor Flanagan, Peter Dworski, who have written for it. Just for everybody else, c2cjournal.ca, of which I've recently become the editor, is an online journal that we want to take to being the central organ of people that are interested in the ideas of free markets, free minds, and property right topics have always played a part in the journal as well. If you're interested in receiving email updates for this journal, please put your email address with the word C2C on a piece of paper in the middle of your table, and I will come and pick them up later. We're also looking for authors. If there's something that you really feel you need to get off your chest, we actually pay people to write sort of $250, $500, depending on the length of the piece. So, you know, it's a project that I really hope a lot of people here will get behind as readers or authors. So that was c2cjournal.ca, sponsor's message over. Oh, and the next issue that's coming out at the end of this month is the issue, Everything You Know is Wrong. So not something that you'd want to miss out on reading. So please check it out if you have a moment. Anyhow, I think we should get back to property rights and this theme that I think is kind of percolated through the weekends, that we know we're right, but we need the language and the narrative to sell. And on this topic of urban planning, I think we've got the diagnosis pretty much right, that if you try to centrally direct the production of something like housing, you end up with mismatches of supply and demand, the price goes up, and you get massive deadweight losses in the economy. I mean, none of that is very complicated or controversial anymore, at least not amongst people like Wendell and Randall and people that have spent a huge amount of their time going through the evidence. However, one area where I disagree with Wendell says, well, look, the purpose of planning should not be the form of the city that we get, but the outcomes that we have in terms of affluence and economic growth. And I think that when it comes to the political battle in which we're engaged, it's actually very important to have a competing narrative. And I was speaking to somebody last night who has bought into a very vivid narrative about what the outcomes of urban planning should be. Because this person has lived in Montreal for a number of years and experienced a lifestyle, a way of getting around, a way of shopping and enjoying different activities in the urban core, and that is real and tangible. And so one of the suggestions that I would make is that actually public opinion is already on our side, but we need to do a better job of the imagery and painting the picture of what a city based on a property rights rather than a regulatory approach to land use decisions might look like. When I say the evidence is on our side, there are some real advantages and disadvantages to being from New Zealand. The UN recently did a survey of young New Zealanders, which was probably a disadvantage for the individuals involved, but it was about what are the great fears of 20 to 35-year-olds. And in a lot of countries it was probably awful things like genocide and the kinds of things you read about in the international section. But in all seriousness, the greatest fear of 20 to 35-year-old New Zealanders was being stuck in an apartment for the rest of their lives. I'm not making this up, we're faced with some serious problems down there. And I always say to my friends in the think tank world, people that live in Nepal and have a 4-hour contingency plan for getting out of the country if things go bad with the Maoists there. I hope that one day you will have our problems. The point is that is the greatest fear of young New Zealanders, according to a poll by the UN, which of course I trust implicitly. And what's more, we have the revealed preferences of people. If you look at the data from census to census on this side of the border and in the US, people choose a certain urban form that planners are trying to oppose. In fact, actually, if people were already choosing what planners wanted, then of course they wouldn't need to be imposing all these restrictions on property rights. So there is a certain circularity to it. And generally speaking, I think that we can say that public opinion does actually want the more organic kind of growth. However, the image hasn't been sold as well as perhaps it could be. And so I think one of the things that we need to do is start taking the fight and say, look, big dreams begin in big backyards. We need the imagery of people being able to have friends over for barbecues with space. We need to paint what it is like to live in an area of extended space. Maybe people don't like that particular imagery. Let me try another one. The broader point here is that we need to paint better pictures, not that I support any particular one. Another one is that while the current ethos in a lot of city halls around the country is one that there is a good way to live and there's a bad way to live, another one is that we are pro-choice, in a manner of speaking. In that actually I don't have a particular urban form in mind, but what I do have is a concern for what is the role of government in trying to shape it, which is kind of what I think Randy was getting at, the idea that planning is always done, but my question is who plans for whom? And so another idea is that we support organic growth of cities, that the most beautiful parts of cities Inglewood in Calgary, I think it's called Rosedale in Toronto, 13th Avenue in Regina, all predate the 1920s when planning in the formal sense we know it today came to Canada. So why don't we support organic cities? Or here's another one, why don't we support Google cities? Google, a fantastically innovative company, and unlike Microsoft, invent 2 programs and then dine out on it for 30 years. Google are developing driverless cars, fantastic new ways to track vehicles, charge vehicles for driving, and most importantly, drive themselves. Why should Calgary, for example, not aim to become the first jurisdiction in Canada, in cooperation with the province, of course, to allow autonomous vehicles? And so we have the image of the most mobile civilization or society in history because it relentlessly uses technology. There's no technological advances on the other side, by the way. I've been on light rail. You don't sort of feel like you might accidentally press the wrong button and go into orbit on one of those. However, the potential for advances in vehicle technology, private vehicle, where people are sharing vehicles, the line between what's a public transport and private transport blurs as those vehicles do customized routes. You can request them on your phone, find out where they are, have them drive to you, pick you up, park somewhere else, so you have this massive windfall of space in the urban settings. It is potentially quite a seductive vision. So I'm not a political image maker, but what I do know is that from the conversation I've had recently, and not the first of its kind, there is a very strong imagery around what the urban planning profession are trying to create. Something like what you experience if you go to downtown Rome or London. Of course, Wendy will tell you that actually knows the data in Rome's nowhere near as dense as people think, but putting that aside, that's the image that people want. And I think that one of the things we have to do, if we agree on what we believe should happen around the shape of cities and the use of property rights and the use of regulation compared to each other, is actually start to sell it passionately that this is not just technically correct, but it's a better way to live. Aside from that, please check out c2cjournal.ca. Thank you.
We're just getting the sound set up for the microphone, and then we'll be able to pass around questions, and the mics on the table should be on for the panelists to address the questions from their seats.
So just raise your hand when you want a question. You have a question.
Okay. I'm from Lattimer, and from, I'd like to confirm.
The mic's not that way, sir, just so
I don't need my.
Oh, well.
For the recording. It's near here, I can show. And out near us, Glentay, where a farmer wants to sell 200 acres to a developer. It has now been 6 years, $700,000 to $800,000 in fees and searches for Indian artifacts, and it's still not quite approved because somebody saw what kind of bird? Bobolink. And so they weren't allowed to do any development now until bobolink has hatched their eggs. This is the sort of stuff that Randy's been saying, and it's getting worse all the time. So I'm just confirming what he said about Matt. I'm glad I don't do it right there where he is. Am I right, Randy?
Absolutely. The problems are, just as you say, and there's so many examples. The number of examples are endless. I use the example of the one-bedroom addition. If the planning process is that extensive for that level of development, we can just begin to extrapolate what the level of the permitting process and the approval process for something greater, like that subdivision over at Glentay that you mentioned, 6, 7 years. It's not unusual to take 6 or 7 years to get those approvals. And I guess the other thing that I should say there, once you're into that system, the system creates uncertainty of itself. Because you may get through the initial sets and then find out that, yes, there was a bottling found, or that there was an Indian arrowhead, or something that may have looked like an Indian arrowhead, or whatever found, which just then further extends the approval process and the cost. And clearly we should be able to see that if that subdivision could have been done in a normal process of maybe a year or two for the approval process, the lots would sell for X. When it takes 6, 7, 8 years, and with countless studies to get the approvals, the cost of those lots are going to be 2X or 3X or some other magnitude number, and that's what we're seeing now.
Randy, the question I have in today's discussion is your municipal planners, your regional planners, all are dealing with what essentially comes down from the legislature. Now, I understand you sit on the left-hand side of the aisle, not the right hand. But in your discussions, these flow from provincial legislation. They don't come out of nowhere. So can you put a discussion around, if you can share, what are the challenges between, let's say, yourself as a rural MPP and your urban colleagues on the challenges of what should be delegated from provincial legislation to the municipalities to deal with this issue?
Well, I guess I'd say most people in the provincial legislature, and I think this is probably common in all provincial legislatures, feel far more comfortable, and it's far more convenient to impose a responsibility than to delegate. And that's what, indeed, all these, in Ontario here, and in most provinces in Canada, these urban planning or all planning, official plans, whatever it is, are requirements of provincial governments being imposed on municipal governments. And in my view, the provincial governments usurping what ought to be a fundamental municipal decision in the first place. Right? We in Queen's Park ought not to be telling the municipalities how they ought to plan, what, that should be left up to that municipal level. But the view in Queen's Park is as we've got 106 Cam Woolies down there. Right? We've got 106 people, essentially, who don't believe that people are competent and capable of making decisions, and they don't really believe municipalities are competent and capable either. That's why we impose such rigid criteria around all that. The Provincial Planning Statement, the Smart Growth Act, Places to Grow Act, the Niagara Escarpment, on and on and on. We don't have, we've got 107 smarter people in Queen's Park than anywhere else in the province. Some might think.
I'm going to ask a bit of a counterfactual question, and I know Randy's spoken about this before, but 120 years ago when Sir Oliver Mowat was first elected Premier, there were still farms on Bloor Street. If, let's say for argument's sake, Ontario had the sort of planning regulations it had then that it has today, where would we be? Not here.
Good answer.
Yeah, absolutely. If we had a planning regime anywhere similar to what we have today at the inception of our province, we would not be part of the Western world. We would never experience growth and prosperity. We would still be looking for an ox to plow the field on Bloor Street.
My comment is
First off, I gotta clarify something, that Randy has not been home for over 10 years. When he put his sign up on his property, it said "back off government." And since he's been elected, he keeps going down that road, turns around and goes somewhere else. I'm an elected official in the township of Great Lakes, and 5 years ago, I went to put a single bedroom on my house also. And 2 years of fighting with the township and $10,000 in legal fees, I finally ended up with that addition on my property. The comment from the council then was that it is the Conservation Authority has all the say. And I've sat on the Conservation Authority and tried to get the point across that the municipality has the say in final planning decisions. The Conservation Authorities have the right to appeal with the OMB, the Ontario Municipal Board. I got elected on that council, and a couple of months ago, the statement was made again by a couple of the councillors that the Conservation Authorities have all the say. They don't have all the say, and that's the problem why we're having problems with planning, is that the councillors are listening to a planner who has put something in the official plan that changes the structure of how we develop our property, but they don't have that say. The elected officials are the ones that have the say. There's something in the province called the provincial policy statement. Everybody here knows about it. It's a guideline. We read the guideline and then we hire a planner on. The planner interprets that, generally with a consultant who has the same ideal as the municipality beside us and the municipality beside that, because it's the same consultants that develop these official plans for our planners. So that's where the problems lie, is that the interpretations of the provincial policy statement are skewed and they're brought to the council, and the council doesn't even read the provincial policy statement, let alone the official plan, and it's passed, and then we have to deal with it. So I think if we start at the bottom, where the root problem is at the municipalities, to make sure that these elected officials are held accountable, that's where we have some legs. And I still go back to the issue of property rights or land rights, and I hear Randy talking about land rights, and I hear the other speakers talking about property rights. I myself think that we need to deal with the land rights, not the property rights first.
Thank you, Jeff. I think that's what we brought up in Scott, in my motions to the legislature, to the federal house. That's what we used that terminology, real property, to distinguish, and that's just. But yeah, that's where the bulk of the problems is in our real estate and regulatory takings and listen, you're on council, you've experienced it yourself. It's the same thing at the provincial legislature. Although we don't, there's a commonality belief that we don't trust other people to make decisions. There is also that underlying view that's held by most legislators, is that there are others who are subject matter experts in every field, and we don't have the competencies to challenge those subject matter experts. So your municipal council with the Conservation Authority views them as the experts and will defer and not exercise their authorities when they come in.
Yeah, let me add also, we're facing a very big, difficult challenge here in bringing public opinion around to support the kind of actions we need out of the provincial parliaments around the country. I agree with David, for example, that we need to paint better images, and we need to cite studies around that indicate that not everybody wants to be in a pack and stack community. At the same time, the reason I'm concerned, for example, about talking about urban form is that when people begin to look at it, and you basically contrast the good of people versus the architecture of an urban area, they're going to be on our side. In addition to that, we're going to need people on the left too. There aren't enough of us. I mean, how long has it been since you've had a good right-wing government in Ontario? And so the basic point is, if you go back and read the literature of the urban containment movement, you're going to find these people are really concerned about social inclusion. They're very concerned about the fact that there are large numbers of low-income people that don't have access to public transport that might get them everywhere from Newmarket to Oshawa. It simply doesn't exist. Of course, the reality is it never can exist. And so to bring reasonable people around on the other side, I think we need to be making these kinds of arguments about poverty, arguments about affluence and so on. So again, I think we really need all of the above in this battle, not just poverty.
I want to share a story about something that I learned recently from hanging around with people in the planning department at my university, and it reinforces the lesson that Randy was talking about distrust, and I want to draw the implications for centralization. And this has to do with what would appear to be an extremely small change, and I think it's the Provincial Planning Act. And it used to be back in, from my point of view, the good old days, for my planning colleagues, the bad old days, that the language said that municipal land use decisions, local land use decisions, must have regard for provincial guidelines and policy statements. Okay? So that was the language in Ontario for anybody from outside of Ontario. The very distrust that Randy was talking about led to what appears to be a small change in words, so that the language is now must be consistent with. Huge change in the working out of how land use decisions are made, but it really kicks the ball back to the provincial legislature about what forces led to that change in language, and what, if anything, can be done to take us back to my good old days, my planning colleagues' bad old days, have regard for versus be consistent with. Small change in language, huge change in outcomes, I think. Any comments, Randy?
Yeah, that was 2005, I believe.
2005.
When they made that small little wordsmithing change, but powerful impacts. Shall have regard for and be consistent with are different words, and they have different meanings. and you know, it is now viewed in the planning department that with planners that they must be in compliance with, and that's what we're seeing happening. So in some regards we've actually even started to constrain the constrainers with that language, but it doesn't serve anybody well at the end of the day. The discussion to move forward. Listen, everything done in the legislature is done with noble, righteous intent. You know, and it really is an odd discussion when you have, when you bring up example after example to legislators of how this is going wrong and not achieving what was intended. But it's still viewed as still the best thing to do. We retain that authority. We will tell them what to do. And I wish I could. We've got our work cut out for us. I do believe that, you know, all of us, the language is going to be important. We need to start using that more caring and compassionate language, and start speaking in terms and tones that liberals and progressives that resonate with liberals and progressives, because economic prosperity does not resonate with these guys. You know, having a more prosperous life is not. They've got a tin ear to that language altogether.
Just a comment. I found that in Ontario, as they've increased the, density of the downtown areas, and many times because we have a very militaristic top-down planning process, and there's a bit of a contradiction in terms of a lack of sincerity when it comes to advocating for environmental issues, which fundamentally we all agree with to a certain extent. like more emphasis is placed, for example, in the city of Ottawa on whether or not you put your green bin out, then there are fundamental planning issues like right to sunlight if you own a piece of property. So I mean, what I'd like to try to see, and I'd like to have your comments on it, that yes, we want to have less regulation that is purely, how would I say, an attempt to kind of make us all march in order according to whoever is singing the song at the time, but one that's more based on things like right to sunlight, on the fact that when you have a piece of property and if you have increased density, if somebody builds a building next door to you, then as a property owner, you probably should have the right that somebody doesn't take away your sunlight. And I know that this is an issue that kind of isn't necessarily environmentalism marrying with some of the issues we've talked in the conference, but I think that there's a huge insincerity, I find, in our planning departments in the city where they talk about green bins on one hand, but they let us lay out, in our northern climate, houses that have no windows that face south. They allow, so there really isn't a sincerity with respect to the kinds of regulations they're putting together when it relates to the other lip service they give to the environment. So I'm not sure if you have any comments on this idea.
Yeah, I mean, I think, everyone uses issues as a foil from time to time. There's no doubt that if you can co-opt the environmental movement for some other objective you may have, then that's a very powerful political strategy. But the other thing I would say is that there seems to be a real problem with regulation making at the municipal level. I mean, you might think that regulations were a way of rectifying market failures, which doesn't mean that you dislike what the market delivers. It means that the equilibrium is not Pareto optimal, and even then I wouldn't be certain that a regulation is actually going to do any good. But so far as having a checklist to find out if there's a need for a regulation, if there's an alternative to define the problem it's trying to solve, and have some sort of test or some sense whether it's actually going to improve the matter. Most municipalities, so far as I can tell, are decades behind any kind of regulatory best practices. So you have all these regulations which are not solving any particular problem in the market. They're just there to impose some sort of arbitrary virtue or value that the regulator thinks people should have. So one of the biggest things that could be done, not just in the area of land use, but regulation of municipalities generally, is to introduce some more disciplined, transparent procedures for making bylaws and regulations. And I think if we did that, we would avoid a lot of the problems that we currently have by default.
And in connection with what David indicates, part of that process should be an objective look at the basis of what is supposedly justifying the regulation. I mean, if you look at what's gone on across this country, and the Vancouver people, and by Vancouver people I mean the Metro Vancouver, have for years talked about the necessity to preserve agricultural land. And with all due respect, there's no problem with the lack of agricultural land in this country. As I indicated in my presentation yesterday, the amount of agricultural land taken out of production in this country from its peak is greater than the land area of the Maritimes. So, and meanwhile, the land area of the municipalities in the urban areas is nothing compared to that. There are any number of other areas where we see in the States and here planners who think it is yesterday. Are not prepared to take a look at how things have planned, how things have improved, and so on. So there's a real need, I think, to make sure that we are dealing with factual bases on planning and not just, sort of preconceived biases. And the agricultural issue is just one of many.
Yeah, I might just add, there are some, I believe there are some legitimate criteria that you can establish. Like, clearly, it would be appropriate for, it's need to set minimum frontage levels for lots.
and even for the provinces set minimum frontages for on provincial highways and whatnot. There are things that are good and proper and serve everybody's interest. But if we're looking for more sunlight and thinking that planning's going to get it, come down to Bay Street and you don't see the sunshine down there too often. You're always in shadows, and that's been done under a planning regime, without a doubt. So, I think we need to just take a step back and say, what criteria are sensible, reasonable, which are going to allow people to develop their properties in a way that that meets their that will give them happiness, and I have absolute confidence that people will do that in a fashion that will be beneficial for everybody.
Hi, I was just wondering what we haven't talked about so far is getting into the universities, into the planning schools, because they teach this collectivist garbage. It's counterfactual even from planning history. Density is not good for human beings because of disease, the concentration of pollution. So if we want to paint a picture, we have to start painting, show the reality of their side, because it's academics rip right through. I mean, you don't want to be downtown Toronto in a flu outbreak situation. You don't want to live in a condominium in a flu outbreak situation, because you have to get on the elevator with other people. You have to be with other people. And these universities get accredited by the province in some way on how that works. So there's something there, because if you take an 18-year-old who's just wants to get through the day, and they don't really know their history, and they're taught this, and they're taught, now you're the authority. And it's very authoritarian, but you know best, you know better than anyone in the world. So they come out 22 years old, they know what's right. And that's the problem. So you're talking to your planning departments, and that's all they know, all this kind of utopian stuff that they've been told. So is there a way we can get into the universities somehow and start giving presentations? I know that the Institute is doing some of that, but I mean, giving money to go in there and give presentations to it, because they have to hear the other side before they get out.
Well, I mean, I think you got to get your diagnosis right first. There's a certain megalomania in the profession, it seems, but I'm not sure if the profession makes people like that, or if it attracts people like that to start with. So, but first of all, we've got to get the diagnosis right. If it's the latter, then I think there's really not a lot of help for us. But if it's the former, then one of the things, and by the way, some of my best friends are urban planners, I just want to make that clear. But one of the things I notice is that they just don't have any economics. I remember explaining to one of my planner friends, I said, look, we have evidence that this metropolitan urban boundary is making land 8 times more expensive 2 kilometers inside the boundary than it is 2 kilometers outside the boundary. I mean, if you ever wanted a clear indication of what growth containment does to the price of urban land, then that's it. Very obvious. You could see it on a map. And I think Wendell had some slides to that effect yesterday. And she said to me, well, yes, but don't you think it's good to live closer together and drive less? Of course, if you had any kind of economic training or way of thinking, then the first thought would be, I think that that may be true, but we need to think at the margin, and so it's only true up to a certain point. But she didn't have that kind of thinking whatsoever. To her, it's just 100% in one direction or the other. So look, it would be good even if the planning profession caught up 150 years and did the marginal revolution. It would be a good start. So.
Yeah, and I would argue beyond that. I mean, I think it's a great idea to try to influence the planning schools to come around to reality, but with all due respect, I would urge that we might first attempt to get the College of Cardinals to support a position favorable toward abortion. I mean, we're dealing here with religion, regrettably. And all of that said, that doesn't mean it doesn't mean there's no hope. It means political activism. It means, you know, there are people of goodwill who are on these city councils and so on, and we've got to find a way to begin to get, we're not going to convince the planners. We ought to try, but we're not going to convince a lot of them. And so I really think it's important to have a strategy that goes beyond it and around the people of goodwill who are sort of open. And that's not easy, but it may be easier than winning the planners over.
Okay, I'm told I'm the last question. I wanted to comment on one thing. It's, we can have plans, but those plans need to be enforced. And I think one sort of strategy may be of making people who are usually not sympathetic with private property be more sympathetic to this issue, is to focus on the issue of privacy. And I don't know how many people here are aware, but in Ontario, British Columbia, and Quebec, municipal law enforcement can go on your property without a warrant, right? Unlike in criminal investigations. When they pass a law saying, Randy, you can't build an apartment upstairs in your attic, they have to enforce that plan. And the way they enforce it is they can go ahead and go on your property and peek through your window. And so all of these plans have consequences on enforcement, and I was wondering if maybe you could comment a little bit on enforcement. And they do that, by the way. They climb your fence, they will peek in your windows. I've written about this in the National Post last year. They do this, they peek in your window. Gregory, I know you know now. Not because anybody peeked in your window, but because you were here last year when I gave the talk about but they do peek in your windows, and it might lend a more sympathetic here.
Always are.
People might be more sympathetic and they might care more about privacy, and one of the consequences of all of this planning is that people's privacy is negatively affected.
I agree, you know, I think, yeah. That's why I have a 1,400-foot long laneway, so I can see there are certainly people who have that concern for privacy, Peter, but I think that's also been taken a beating over the decades as well. I remember growing up as a kid in this province, privacy was up here in people's regard for and respect of. But I think we've seen that diminished more so over the decades as well. And you get an awful lot of people who think that the only people who want privacy are people who are doing inappropriate things. That's why people peek in your window.
Nothing to hide.
See here. But I think that is part of the discussion, Peter. And listen, as we become a more urbanized society, we lose respect for privacy. Because we just don't live with it. We don't have it to the same degree.
Yeah, I think it's a great point.
Wendell, any closing words?
Was that? Oh, no, but I do agree with the other panelists.
Thank you very much, guys.